It's 7 o'clock. This is Sky News Breakfast. Here are our top stories this morning. UK scientists say there's no immediate need for a fourth COVID jab, as the current booster gives older adults strong protection.
The booster is not only working, but it's working for a long period of time.
Downing Street drinks fresh claims by the Prime Minister's former advisor, Dominic Cummings, of another garden gathering during the first lockdown. A third day in detention for the world's best tennis player as the blame game continues over the handling of Novak Djokovic's vaccine exemption.
Honestly, I hope that it all gets sorted as soon as possible. Like, for the sport, we need him here. It's that simple. Like, he's one of the most influential sports people probably of all time. Justice at last. The family of the murdered jogger Ahmed Arbery celebrate as his three killers are sentenced to life in prison. Overcoming the odds, the refugee children determined to succeed in the classroom after a challenging start to school. And a second century of the game for Australia's Usman Khawaja has left England's cricketers facing a massive job to save the fourth Ashes test in Sydney. The weather, wind and rain will spread eastwards today with sunshine and blustery showers following, but tomorrow looks drier. And at 1:45 we'll take a look at papers with the broadcaster and author Gemma Forte and the editor of Spiked, Tom Slater. Hello there, a very good morning. Thanks for being with us. I'm Jonathan Samuels, and we start today with a positive development in the fight against the Omicron wave sweeping across the country. UK scientists say COVID booster jabs provide 90% protection against hospitalisation in the over 65s for at least 3 months. And this means there's no need for a fourth jab for vulnerable people just yet. But protection for older adults who haven't had a booster is much lower. The UK Health Security Agency says it's prioritising rolling out first booster doses to all age groups. That's as the pressure grows on hospitals facing both a shortage of beds and staff. Sharman Freeman-Powell has our first report.
In the last week of December, 3.7 million people in the UK were infected with coronavirus. But while cases remain high, they are not as severe, and the JCVI credits the booster.
People aged 65 years and above have over 90% protection against being hospitalised. And most importantly, they are protected for up to 3 months from their booster dose. So that's really, really good news. The booster is not only working, but it's working for a long period of time.
While Omicron causes milder symptoms than previous variants, the sheer number of cases means hospitals are overwhelmed. And the medics we usually rely on to look after us are barely coping.
I think the fact that we've had to bring the army in really demonstrates the huge pressures that services are under at the moment. And my members will tell you that it doesn't feel like it's stabilising at the moment. And at the moment, they can't see an end to it.
Hospital staff across the country are exhausted and burnt out. And now the surge in Omicron cases is creating shortages, with many staff off sick and unable to work. But with almost 40,000 NHS staff off sick because of COVID, there are fears that assistance from 1,800 armed forces won't be enough. As it stands, the number of 111 calls are on the rise. Ambulances are waiting more than an hour to hand over patients, and a lack of social care is preventing 10,000 people from leaving hospital beds. But despite this, some experts are hopeful.
We don't know whether there will be any further nasty mutant strains. Always variants are happening. Whether any of those becomes worse for the human race, and particularly us here in the UK, remains to be seen. But at the moment, we're certainly on the right path for Omicron, and it looks to me as though the health service will survive.
There will be more tough times ahead, but there's optimism too, that the darkest days of the winter wave may soon be behind us. Sharman Freeman-Powell, Sky News.
Well, we can show you the latest COVID data now. The United Kingdom recorded 178,250 new COVID cases, as well as 229 deaths in the past 24-hour period, bringing the total number of deaths within 28 days of a positive test to 149,744. Well, as we've been hearing this morning, ambulance workers are among those feeling the pressure being put on the NHS. And I'm joined now by Unison National Officer and former paramedic, Alan Lofthouse. Alan, good to see you this morning. Thanks for joining us. NHS staff still struggling with sickness and being off with COVID. How difficult has it been for the ambulance service?
I mean, it's really, people are struggling at the moment. You know, I mean, every year we report on winter pressures, but this is a winter like no other before. And I think one of the things that's really important is for people to know that those ambulance staff out there, those that are taking the calls in the control centres, those that are responding in ambulances are doing everything they can. But unfortunately, you know, if they're told to self-isolate, they have to take themselves out, which means that there are fewer people out there to answer the number of calls that are coming in. Call numbers are up, and it really is, you know, people are struggling to do the job they love. You know, they're struggling to have a break during their shift. They're struggling to finish on time. The people who are taking the calls are absolutely exhausted. We've had reports that it's never been like this before.
Yeah, I mean, the good news, as we were just hearing, is that we seem to be on the right path now with Omicron, but there's still a long way to go.
Well, absolutely. And what we can't have is a situation where every winter we hit this point, and if there is a new variant, we have, you know, armies responding instead of ambulances. We've got, you know, calls that people are struggling to get to, that, you know, we've got demoralised staff. We need a much more longer term plan to have the right numbers of staff in there so that we're not dipping into these winter crisis points in such a deep way.
In the summer, the government announced this extra £55 million to boost staff numbers, including 999 call handlers. That must have had a big impact, hasn't it?
The thing is with money like that is it isn't recurring. So it doesn't, you know, the ambulance services don't get it each year. So they tend to sort of, you know, be able to throw it at, you know, trying to provide private ambulances to fill demand, but you've only got a limited number of staff there. You know, these are great jobs. People love working in ambulance services, but the pressures are so great at the moment that what we really need is these careers to be looked at, these jobs to be looked at, to really attract people in there long term. So rather than throwing £55 million at it, you look at, you know, over a couple of years to try and get more staff so that you have that extra capacity in the system. Because, you know, we've had 10 years of our ambulance services in real terms being cut right back so that you haven't got the number of staff that used to be there. So it's been, you know, it's very difficult to cope with these sudden surges in demand. So you see ambulance services announcing major incidences and critical incidences. And I just don't think you should have that as a long-term plan. It really doesn't reflect very well on the government. The ambulance service, the employers and the staff themselves are doing everything they can, but they're working in such difficult circumstances.
We've heard these sort of nightmare stories of certain parts of the country where people are being advised to get a relative to drive them to hospital because it'll just take too long for an ambulance to get them to hospital. Cases where it might be a suspected heart attack even, or a stroke. Is that still happening?
Well, yeah, and this is the sort of, you know, the place that ambulance services find themselves in is if they don't have ambulances, what do they tell the public? So our call handlers who take, you know, the phone calls from the public, who then try and work out the number of ambulances they've got to deploy to those people, really struggle. And so what do you say to somebody? You know, a lot of people will contact the ambulance service who have chest pains. Not all of them will be having heart attacks, and not all of them will end up, you know, with their heart being stopped, but it's such a risky thing to do. So, you know, people are really put into a difficult position. And I guess there is something that the public can do on this, which is to really use the 999 service sparingly. Think about, actually, should I be calling 111 instead and getting advice? Can I look after myself? Can friends and family come in and look after me instead of relying on the 999 service? And therefore, you know, when somebody really is unwell, there are ambulances available for them. But these, you know, the people taking the calls are being put into some really difficult positions. And I don't think it reflects on them. I think it reflects, again, onto the fact that they've just been pushed into this by a lack of long-term planning, a lack of funding for ambulance services that's thrown us into this crisis. And then on top of that, you have the new Omicron wave.
Yeah, I mean, you're accusing the government here of the crisis that the service faces. But, of course, it is Omicron, isn't it? It's the fact that it's so transmissible that is causing so many people to be off sick. That's out of the government's control.
Well, yes, I mean, I do accept that. But the fact that every winter we're in a situation where ambulances are queuing for 6-7 hours outside A&Es with patients that they can't offload because the social care system isn't able to take patients out of hospital the other end. I mean, these are long-standing problems, so the government can't really say that this is all Omicron. The unique thing that's happening at the moment is instead of running a winter sickness level at, let's say, 5 or 6%, ambulance services are trying to deal with 16 to 17% sickness level. So yes, that is the new thing, but it's on top of a pretty, cutback service that is trying and struggling to cope with. Every year, demand is up on ambulance services. Every year, this is something that is predictable, and therefore the government should be planning for it. And I think that they aren't.
OK, well, we're all extremely grateful, of course, for the work that ambulance crews have done over the last couple of years and continue to do. Let's hope the darkest days are now behind us. Alan Lofthouse, National Officer for Health for Unison, thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, well, it might be a new year, but the allegations of sleaze surrounding the Prime Minister continue. Boris Johnson's former advisor, Dominic Cummings, is now claiming that another rule-breaking party was held in the Downing Street garden just a few days after staff were pictured enjoying cheese and wine. Sky's chief political correspondent, John Craig, has the latest.
Following the disclosure about Lord Brownlow, the Tory donor, lobbying the PM for a pet project, a great exhibition, well, who should pop up but our old friend, Westminster's favourite pantomime villain, Dominic Cummings. Here is a 14-page blog under the headline Parties, Photos, Trolleys and Variants. And we're back to the allegations about the partying in Downing Street. Now, there's good news and bad news for the PM from Mr Cummings, his former aide. 15th of May, that's the one that featured on the front page of The Guardian a few weeks ago and has aroused all sorts of controversy. There's the photo. 15th of May was no party, says Mr Cummings. But the bad news for the PM, the inquiry should look at the 20th of May, when there was another socially distant drinks, he claims. So what Mr Cummings is saying is that the person at the front of the photo there is a civil servant called Martin Reynolds, and he was sitting there with Mr Cummings. He's in the photo on the left. The picture, the table at the front of the picture, there's the PM and Carrie Johnson there. Mr Cummings said, I had several meetings at that table that day. And then he said the PMI continued after the meetings broke up. Someone brought a bottle of wine out to the table. It may have been Martin, but I think it was the PM himself who went inside. He said he carried on chatting about domestic priorities and so on. Here comes the latest allegation. There was a social event on May the 20th. I and at least one other SPAD, that's a special advisor, said this seemed to be against the rules and should not happen. We were ignored. I was ill and went home to bed early that afternoon, but I'm told this event definitely happened. What does all this mean? It means that Sue Gray, she's the civil servant investigating all these party allegations, is almost certain now to widen her inquiry to include not just the 15th of May, but this new allegation about the 20th of May.
John Craig there. OK, let's head to Australia. The world men's tennis number one, Novak Djokovic, is nearing the end of his third day in an Australian government detention hotel after being denied entry into the country. Earlier, fellow tennis player and famously outspoken Aussie Nick Kyrgios said Djokovic's absence at the upcoming Open would be bad for the sport and that he thinks all the drama will have fired up the defending champion.
If he's allowed to play the Australian Open, I don't want any bar of him. I reckon he's going to be off. He's going to be very determined to play well and stick it to everyone of what's going on. And I don't want any bar of that Novak. Honestly, I hope that it all gets sorted as soon as possible. For the sport, we need him here. It's that simple. He's one of the most influential sports people probably of all time.
Let's head to Melbourne. Join Sky News' Nicole Johnston. Nicole, there are protesters there. Are they for or against the detention?
Well, they're against the detention, and this detention is taking place right behind me in this hotel. It's really a waiting game for Novak Djokovic and his team now. He's about to have his third night in detention. It'll be 4 nights in total until a court meets in Melbourne on Monday to determine whether due process was followed in the cancellation of his visa. In the meantime, he has asked for his personal chef to be able to access him and provide meals for him. He's also asked to be moved from this hotel to some accommodation with a tennis court in Melbourne. Both of those requests have been rejected. At the same time, he now has some extra company inside this hotel, though I think it's probably unlikely they're able to see each other. A Czech player, Renata Varachova, has also had her visa cancelled, going to show what a confusing mess this is turning into. And she's also in this hotel now. As you said, there are protests continuing. A lot of anti-vaxxers have joined the protest, as well as people from Melbourne's Serbian community. A couple of hundred of people are there. It's quite quiet, but they're certainly vocal, and they have been turning out every single day. On the streets of Melbourne, though, there's not a lot of sympathy for the situation of any tennis player who wants to enter Australia without a vaccination. And that's because Melbourne endured one of the toughest lockdowns in the world. More than 260 days of lockdown. In Australia now, more than 90% of people are vaccinated. So it's a really strong pro-vaccination situation here. But again, it's very chaotic about how the Australian Open is going to deal with this, with conflicting reports and leaked messages coming from Tennis Australia and the federal government, with all sides fighting and blaming each other.
OK, we'll learn more on Monday. Nicole, thank you. Having your own personal chef would be nice, wouldn't it? Something to think about. Let's head to the United States now, where a father and son have been sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the 2020 murder of black jogger Ahmaud Arbery. A judge in the US state of Georgia also gave a life sentence to their neighbour, but ruled that he could seek parole after 30 years in jail. Katie Barnfield reports.
Relief for the family of Ahmaud Arbery. Hand in hand, they walked down the courtroom steps after his killers were given life in prison.
I knew that today would come. When it would come, I didn't know, but I know today would finally come.
Yeah, amen.
On the 23rd of February 2020, Ahmaud Arbery, a black American, had gone out for a run in a predominantly white neighbourhood in the US state of Georgia and never came home. Instead, he was targeted by these 3 men, who have now been sentenced for his murder. A judge said that Mr. Arbery was pursued in pickup trucks for 5 minutes before being cornered and shot by father and son Greg and Travis McMichael and their neighbour William Bryan, who claimed they were attempting a citizen's arrest on a suspected burglar.
He was killed because individuals here in this courtroom took the law into their own hands.
But the case has again raised questions about racial justice in the southern United States. Mr. Arbery's family lawyers described the incident as a modern-day lynching. And in response to the jury's verdict in November, President Biden said, "We must recommit ourselves to building a future of unity and shared strength, where no one fears violence because of the colour of their skin." The men waived their right to address the court at the hearing, but their lawyers say they plan to appeal the convictions. Katie Barnfield, Sky News.
Also making news this morning, 16 people have died and 10 others have been injured in an explosion at an office cafeteria in southwest China. It's believed a gas leak caused the blast. A Sky News investigation has revealed that huge numbers of weapons, including firearms and knives, have been seized in courtrooms during the pandemic. Official data shows that over 1,000 knives and blades have been confiscated in Crown Courts since April 2020. It follows concerns over the security of courtrooms after the death of a man who managed to sneak acid into a dock before swallowing it. There's been some progress for people fighting to get cladding laws changed. Leaseholders living in buildings under 18 metres high will no longer have to pay for potentially flammable cladding to be removed from the outside of their homes. A letter seen by Sky News from the Treasury to the Housing Secretary Michael Gove suggests that the Secretary of State will be able to threaten developers with taxation or what's been described as legal solutions to ensure they pay up. New research suggests asylum-seeking children who are separated from their parents are, on average, more than 3 years behind other pupils by the time they take their GCSEs. But a school in North London is working to break down the barriers holding back refugee children in the classroom. Aisha Zahid has been to meet some of the pupils and the staff, offering them supports.
These teenagers all have very different stories to share about how they arrived in the UK. But a determination to succeed is something they all have in common after facing challenging starts at school.
I hope to live with 8s and 9s and wish to get into university and study to be a neurosurgeon.
It's difficult. When you can't talk, it takes time. And it's about the future, because I would like to study business.
I don't know anything about English, about language, about the rules at school. It's so difficult. When I come to the school, I know everything. I know the rules and the language. It's I feel it's good.
It's very important that you study. If you study, like, you get better. Whatever you want to, you do. The first of all, you focus your study. You don't go there another way.
Between them, they've made treacherous journeys to flee dangerous situations in their home countries. Staff here are working hard to ensure they're supported beyond the classroom.
Our main barriers that we're trying to overcome are isolation, vulnerability to organized crime or gangs in the area, being able to make sure that they're not at high risk of any self-harm, and just making sure that there's no abuse in the families. So we try and have after-school activities that help with English, with socialization, making friends, just making sure that their moods and their mental health are being looked after.
Data suggests resettled refugee and asylum-seeking children are around 1.5 years behind their peers in attainment. The gap widens to more than 3 years for those who arrived in the UK separated from their parents. Unaccompanied children are also more likely to face exclusion. Teachers say there needs to be a shift in focus.
Attainment often is just a measure of what a young person arrives with. And they tend to leave with something not dissimilar. Progress is a real measure of a journey that a young person makes from start to finish. So you get the literacy right, you get the curriculum right. We found that with our refugee children, the progress is phenomenal.
The pupils here continue to thrive, and it's hoped there will be plenty more success stories as schools like this one work hard to break down the barriers that can so often stand in the way for refugee children. Aisha Zahid, Sky News.
Hello again. Such sad news, wasn't it, yesterday, to hear about the death of Sir Sidney Poitier, and there have been plenty more tributes from Hollywood and beyond. He was, of course, the first black man to win a Best Actor Oscar for his performance in Lilies of the Field. He died at the age of 94 after the most incredible career. Well, joining me now is the founder of the British Urban Film Festival, Emmanuel Anyam-Osigwe. Great to see you. Thanks for being with us. He was quite remarkable, wasn't he? How have you been reflecting on his life over the last 24 hours?
Well, good morning, Jonathan. It's very surreal to be talking about Sir Sidney Poitier because I'm actually writing a book about prolific black figures in film and television. And understandably, Sidney's name came up because not only was he a prolific actor and literally winning everything that was there, he was also a very prolific film director. Now, I've not met the man, and I wish I did, but I know someone who has, and that would be Rain Pryor, who's the daughter of Richard Pryor. And when I talk about his achievements as a director, he was the first black director to gross a movie over $100 million, and that was Stir Crazy, which starred Richard Pryor and Gene Wilder in 1980. And that's a record that stood for nearly 40 years until it was surpassed by Ryan Coogler's Black Panther. That's just one example of so many prolific firsts that Sidney Poitier achieved. And like I said, I wish I was on set with him. I wish I was in a room with him. I just wish I was on a protest or a civil rights march with him. He was that guy. He was everywhere. He was the foundation for everything that's come since.
Yeah, you mentioned civil rights there, and of course he was a regular, wasn't he, on the big screen at the time of racial segregation in the US. What impact did he have?
Well, I'm sure many of your viewers have heard stories about him on protest with Harry Belafonte, and what people may not know is what he gave on those marches. I know he provided money from his own pocket, as did Harry and many others, to support civil rights leaders, entertainment being provided for, obviously, the famous march from Selma to Montgomery in 1964, just little things like that. And if we could all kind of find it within ourselves to kind of give back and be humble about, you know, the bigger struggles and the bigger battles that are out there in the world and that are still out there in the world today, then I think we could learn a whole lot from Sidney Poitier. And I'm sure many people have heeded his approach to life.
And of course, away from film, he did a great deal of work in the Bahamas, where he grew up. He was a real humanitarian as well.
He was indeed, yes. He was the ambassador to Japan for 10 years. And not many people know that he actually sat on the board of Disney for 8 years. So this is a man that wasn't just transcending film, race relations, civil rights, politics, but business as well. And like I said, many people have, since Sidney Poitier, gone down that route of doing more across so many fields. I mean, in America, just recently, the great football icon John Madden passed, and he was very prolific in not just commentating, but as a coach and as a player and as a video game. And Sidney Poitier in film is that and many more. You know, there are acronyms such as VIP, MVP, GOAT, GOAT. Sidney Poitier was all of those things and so much more. And I'm so glad that he was around long enough, should I say, to see his flowers being given to him.
Yeah, well said. They're making a Broadway play about his life. There'll be a lot to cram in to that stage production. Great chatting to you, Emmanuel Aniam Osigwe. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jonathan.
Hello again this Saturday morning. Nice to have you with us. We're going to take a look at the papers now with the broadcaster and author Gemma Forte and the editor of Spiked, Tom Slater. Nice to see you both again. Gemma, let's kick things off, shall we, with the FT. I mean, once COVID is less of a pressing issue, the cost of living crisis is really going to bite. And, of course, the government is running out of time when it comes to how to deal with this.
They are, and I think these are the stories that are going to be dominating, sadly, in 2022, as things are going to be getting very difficult for a lot of people financially. So, of course, keeping the triple lock on pensions was a 2019 election pledge and promise. However, Sunak wanting to reel back on that a bit. So whilst it protects state pensions, which are collected by 12 million people, many of whom will be Conservative voters, it does rely on looking at wage growth and also inflation. Now, wages have grown considerably, up to 8%. So it would mean that the state pension went up quite considerably if Sunak sticks to that pledge. But that said, it's only going to go up to about sort of £10,000 a year, or sort of around that figure. I don't have the precise. Yes, that's it, 10,000 a year. Now, £10,000 a year, whichever way you look at it, isn't a great deal to survive on when you think that the cost of food is going up and fuel prices are going to be soaring. When it comes to the elderly, this is such a huge deal because, of course, many will have to make that choice between whether they can eat, whether they can put the heating on. So I have a feeling that this is going to cause a real storm and he's probably going to have to row back on it. that isn't a good look when a lot of MPs recently have decided to do something and then done a U-turn. So we'll see how this pans out. But I really think the elderly have suffered so much in the last couple of years. You know, it is up to these politicians. They are caretakers, if you like, of people. They have to address this fuel crisis really, really urgently. I know the wholesale price of gas isn't their fault, but it's something that needs addressing right away. And I wonder, you know, Boris Johnson at PMQs the other day, he made a really bad slip talking about how people get £140 a week off their bills for fuel relief. They get £140 a year. And you see, it worries me when people in positions of power have so little idea of money in terms of sort of what ordinary people consider a lot of money or a little. It concerns me greatly. And Sunak's wife, of course, is worth 430 million. So I just hope they look after our elderly and make sure that they don't freeze to death.
Yeah, it's going to be a real crunch point, isn't it, in the spring, especially when that energy price cap changes take place. Tom, let's talk about the story that is in the Telegraph. Dominic Cummings, he dropped another dossier, didn't he, yesterday? What did we learn?
Yes, another one of his kind of interminable blog posts has landed. This one alleging that on the 20th of May 2020, there was a socially distanced drinks party in the Downing Street garden. This was 5 days after that now kind of infamous wine and cheese get-together in the garden, which was splashed across the front page of The Guardian and which Dominic Cummings was actually in attendance at. Interestingly, Mr Cummings is saying that the one on the 15th that he was at was completely legit, but the one on the 20th that he wasn't at was wrong, and he warned against it. So I guess viewers will make up their own mind about this. But it is just this kind of never-ending story about rule breaking in Number 10, or alleged rule breaking, shall we say. I tend to have kind of two conflicting feelings about it. On the one hand, there is the hypocrisy. There is the sense that you're seeing, you know, Number 10 being shown to have, you know, had parties last Christmas at a time when students were being fined £10,000 for having house parties. That sense of one rule for them, one rule for everyone else. But I can't be the only one who feels like these stories are becoming increasingly marginal on the level of rule breaking that's being alleged. They were outside and all the rest of it. And I also think it's quite interesting that Cummings thinks he has any kind of moral authority on the questions of the rules and when they have been bent or broken, given a lot of people still haven't forgiven him for the whole Barnard Castle debacle. So, yes, this story continues to run and run, but I can't be the only one who feels like the wheels are falling off just a little bit.
OK, interesting points. Let's move on to The Guardian. Gemma, we've been discussing this all morning. The very sad passing of Sidney Poitier. What a towering figure he was.
Absolutely, and you have had some really amazing tributes on Sky this morning. So I won't add much other than to say that he was an exquisite actor in things such as Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, In the Heat of the Night. Of course, he was the first black actor to receive an Oscar in 1964. He was incredibly handsome, but it's also, of course, every time we mention Sidney Poitier, we mention the fact that he was black, because he was a huge trailblazer. To be cast in a film in anything other than, you know, at the time, and as he said himself, every portrayal of a black person on screen at the time was negative. Buffoons, clowns, shuffling butlers, really misfits. And then he came along and he decided, I will not be stereotyped. So he tried to pick his roles as carefully as he could. And there's a fantastic quote where from one of his films, he said, it wasn't about marrying a white woman on screen. It's more about slapping a racist white man on camera. And you just have to look at the history of the time to understand how monumental moments like this were, and where he began. Hopefully we reach a point where black actors aren't always mentioned, you know, the colour of their skin as he had to be at that time. What a man.
Yeah, what a man indeed, all done with such grace and charm. Tom, some good news for once about COVID and coronavirus. The Daily Mail saying that Omicron patients are 90% less likely to be hospitalised compared with previous waves, providing they've been boosted.
Yes, exactly. So what we're seeing here is just the effect of the Omicron variant being somewhat milder, but also, importantly, just these boosters have really been incredibly effective in terms of pushing down hospitalisation and death. We've seen the Health Secretary say that in this current wave, it's now guaranteed, at his words, that this will not cause a surge in deaths. And this is a huge change of tune, we should remember, because in the week before Christmas, of course, we had Sage modelers suggesting and projecting that potentially we could soon hit 6,000 deaths a day. You know, it's currently somewhere between 1 and 200 has been the sort of average. So it really, really is good news. It shows that really what a lot of the South African medics were saying when Omicron first arrived, that it was milder, that they were seeing mild cases, that the vaccines were holding up and that boosters were particularly effective. All of that has really been borne out. And whilst there is pressure on the NHS at the moment, it does feel like all the signs are very positive, not just for the kind of next couple of weeks, but the sense that we'll have to go back into restrictions anytime soon whatsoever. So, yes, very good news in the mail today.
Yeah, let's hope so. I've been an optimist throughout the whole coronavirus crisis, and it's not really done me much good. But let's hope your optimism, Tom, will carry us through. I'm sure it will. Now, let's talk about exercise, Gemma. The Alzheimer's Society warning that dementia is on the rise with the older population, but there are ways that we can help combat it and keep our brains healthy.
Yeah, and I would say that this is another positive story. Researchers in California have found that exercise keeps the brain young. So we know that it keeps the body sort of trim and the muscles strong, etc. But there's a class of proteins that enhance connections between brain cells. And when you exercise, these get firing and they can help stave off dementia. They're saying 150 minutes a week can help stave off cognitive decline. I love being active. I love exercise. I hate diets. So this is good news for me. And if it encourages people to get out for a walk and keep going into their old age, I think this is really good, positive news to hear. Because, you know, it doesn't have to mean killing yourself in a gym. It just can be a really good fast walk as well. And I'm already at the stage where I go up sometimes upstairs and can't remember why. So I probably need to maybe do a bit more.
Excellent. And Tom, you've got 20 seconds to tell us about this unicorn.
Yes, so scientists are stepping up the hope for this Asian unicorn, which is just a name for a very elusive animal which lives in Laos and Vietnam. Its numbers believed to have been plunging even potentially below 100, so rare that no biologist has ever actually seen it in person. So concerns that this very rare and fascinating species might die out if we're not careful, unfortunately.
Good stuff. Tom, Gemma, great to see you both. We'll speak again in half an hour.